I'm Melanie Saywood, and you are tuning in to The Pink Elephant. Hey, Pink Elephant listeners. In this month's episode, I wanted to share a subject that I learned about last year at Bible college. For me, this subject, which is probably most accurately titled the Retribution Principle, has been such a perspective changer on how I read the Old Testament. But even more so, I see how aspects of the Old Testament are grossly misinterpreted and applied today because of not understanding this principle. It's been a real wake up call and warning to me personally, but it has also grown my appreciation for the Old Testament. I knew that I would not be able to do this subject justice if I talked about it by myself. So this month, I have a great guest who has joined me. This very person is the person who has taught me about this particular subject. Her name is Edwina Blair, and she's an associate lecturer in biblical studies, which includes teaching Hebrew, and she leads Holy Land tours for the college. She's a wife and a mum too. She's got a daughter, and she's studying one of the most interesting topics for her PhD that she's doing right now. It's actually all about anthropomorphism, which I'm glad I was able to get that out right, which is basically a literary device that's used to attribute human qualities to God or animals. So, yeah, it happens in the Bible a lot. She's specifically studying how this is in reference to senses like smell when it's used in the Bible, which I just think is so interesting. And in fact, we'll probably get her back on the podcast when she's finished doing that. But I first met Edwina when I studied Hebrew, and I remember just being so blessed by her humility, her appreciation for the Word of God, and her quirky sense of humor. She's seriously so authentic, which I'm sure will come through in this month's episode. But she's so much more than that too. You know, about 2 years ago, I had to pull out of a unit because of some health stuff that was going on with my daughter. Don't worry, my daughter's all good now, but it was a very emotional time for me as a mum. Because I had to pull out late, I had to have like a good explanation for why I was dropping the subject. And I let Edwina know what was going on, and I seriously just felt so pastored by her. She was such a caring person. And even after a few months, when we didn't really even have anything to do with each other because I wasn't doing a unit with her, she still checked in on me to make sure that I was doing all right. She wasn't obligated to, she just did that out of the goodness of her heart. So, as you can tell, I have so much respect for Edwina, both personally and professionally. And I'm confident that you will be blessed by what she has to share on this topic. With all that said, let's talk about retribution principles with Edwina Blair. It's so good to have you with us, Edwina. And I know that, we've had a little bit of a history with studying Hebrew and Old Testament, but I know that some of the people who listen regularly to this podcast may have no idea about who you are. So I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I live in Sydney, Australia. I'm, we'll say 50 plus. At the moment, I'm what you would call like an early academic. So I work at our National Bible College for Churches of Christ in Australia, which is an online college. And I teach in the area of biblical studies, particularly Old Testament, ancient Hebrew. You've been one of my students.
Yes.
Love that. And I run our Holy Land program where I take students to Israel and Jordan. So that's really what I've been doing in the last full time in the last kind of 7 years. Before that, though, I was part time and also an associate in our local churches, in Churches of Christ. And really, I've been doing that for 20 plus kind of years. I obviously did other things before that, but I won't bore you with all those kind of things. I'm also a PhD student. So
Awesome.
hope to finish my PhD in the Hebrew Bible at the end of next year. I'm now
Wow.
putting that out publicly, so I hold myself to that. But yeah, married. My husband is the pastor of our local church. We have an adult daughter who's studying in the UK at the moment. So that's kind of my life.
Yeah, right. So just have you been a Christian all your life, or, how did you come to faith?
I grew up in the church, so I grew up in the Uniting Church. I actually remember it becoming the Uniting Church. I can't remember the denominations that came together to form the church, but I remember as a child the big celebration. I would say I became a Christian myself into my own decision probably when I was 15, 16 in the Churches of Christ, and have really just had a consistent faith since then. I went through a divorce in my early 20s, and that's
Hmm.
probably was a significant kind of step up in my faith in terms of not relying on other people, family, partners, that kind of stuff. And so it's just really grown from then. So
Wow.
yeah, it's been
That's
a
so interesting.
distant part of my life. Um,
Yeah.
but in very, you know, particular stages.
Mm.
Point where, then I became a minister, which I never ever thought. And married to a minister. He was an engineer when I married him, so not what we expected. I was working in nuclear medicine at the time, so
Oh,
it's
wow.
where we thought we would end up. So,
How
but
interesting.
yeah, loving it.
Well, you're obviously very passionate about the Old Testament because even if you just hear what you've been doing as far as college,
Yeah,
it's Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, and then
yeah.
Old Testament, biblical studies. And what is it about the Old Testament that you're clearly attracted to?
I think I've always been a learner.
Mm.
So, and a teacher as well. Like even straight out of high school when I kind of had to go to uni because that's what just was an expectation.
Yeah.
Like I didn't know what to do. So I started primary school teaching. So there's always been this kind of teacher thing in me. And I think as a student, when I was at Bible college, I realized how much, as someone who has grown up in the church, how much I just did not know.
Mm.
I was quite embarrassed by that. I just didn't realize that, the kingdom divided, for example, or
Yes.
Old Testament like timelines. So I think I realized how much I didn't know. And then I realized how much other people who are Christians, who are supposed to be reading their Bible, and that's not a criticism because I obviously didn't read my Bible enough either. So I really dug in for my own benefit to actually learn this part that I just didn't know.
Mm.
And then when I kind of shifted into teaching, one of the things, and you've been in my classes, I just love putting the pieces together. And there are so many pieces in the Old Testament. And I find that students or Christians basically, because I'm passionate about like just biblical literacy in our churches,
Mm.
that they know these kind of pieces of the Old Testament story in particular, but they don't know how the pieces fit together.
Mm.
And so my job as a teacher is creating this puzzle piece where they can actually put the pieces they already know into the puzzle and see the whole picture.
Mm.
And so that's, I love the aha moments where students or any people that I teach in church and stuff just go, oh, I actually want to really read that now because like
Yes.
really cool.
Yeah, yeah. That would definitely be my experience of having done the Old Testament subject that you taught. Yeah, and I would say I'm a quite avid reader of the Bible in the sense that I've probably had a devotion time every day since I was quite young, but I even didn't work out those little pieces of the puzzle. I just read it, and I suppose some of it too is that we tend to read sections, right? So we read a chapter
Yeah.
and we don't quite know how it all fits together because we're just reading one piece at a time and getting different
Absolutely.
revelation from that. Yeah, so I definitely had an aha moment. I'm pretty sure I let you know when I was doing the facilitation with you. Yeah, so
Yeah. And
yeah.
I say to a lot of my students, if you get nothing else, and these are the students who do like introduction to Old Testament, which is
Mm.
you see a bird's eye view of the Old Testament on purpose,
Mm.
is that if nothing else, that you've got like the skeleton of the timeline of the chronology of the big story, if you like, that you could open any text in your Bible, any book of the Bible, and you just know where it fits.
Mm.
And we talk about the layers, and just because you turn the page doesn't mean the thing happened next.
Mm.
And just having those kind of little pieces of information helps you then bring some context to what you're reading, and it
Mm.
just means so much more. Um,
Absolutely.
so, I love that people have regular devotional times because a lot of people don't.
Mm.
You don't kind of know where what you're reading fits into everything else.
Absolutely.
You're losing so much depth, and the depth that brings, as Christians, I don't talk about Jesus enough because I live in the
Because you're in the Old Testament. Yep.
Yeah, when students who love Jesus then understand the foundation on which Jesus lived and ministered, like the richness, it's just,
Absolutely.
you can tell I could talk about this all day.
Well, I could too. And I really enjoyed doing the Old Testament. And I think it even showed in how I went in that subject. Because I was recently looking back at my grades and I went, whoa, I think I might have done the best in that subject out of all of the ones I've done so far at ACOM. So I was like, oh, wow, that really obviously had an effect. And it's also changed how I read. I've gone back and read Job and also Ecclesiastes, which I used to say was my favorite book. And then since doing an Old Testament unit, I've come back to it and gone and looked at it again. And I've realized that I was reading it in such a different way when I was younger. And I wouldn't say it's my favorite now because it's so challenging, like it's so deeply challenging. But it's definitely like I can't ignore this book. Like it's still up there. It's just the challenge is so big. It's hard to say it's my favorite, right? So, is there a favorite story for you? Like in the Old Testament, is there some a book of the Bible story, verse, or something that you just go, wow, that's the standout for me?
I think I have. So in terms of the prophets, the book of Habakkuk is my favorite kind of prophetic book.
Mm,
Ezekiel as well, because I've done a lot of study in Ezekiel, so I understand the crazy of a bit more. I have probably people
yes.
that I love in the scripture. So Jonathan is
Mm,
really important for me. So not so much a book. I guess, yeah, it kind of depends. I was a worship pastor and a worship leader for a long time, so I was always in the Psalms. So
mm,
being able to go to something that articulates how I feel is also something
mm.
has been quite dear to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like asking your favorite child, I think.
Yeah, it's an unfair question, isn't it? I shouldn't have asked it, but sometimes it tells you something about the person too when you talk about what is your favorite and all that kind of stuff. But no need to psychoanalyze me on my Ecclesiastes one though.
And Jesus, of course. Jesus.
Jesus, yes, of course. Well, the topic that I've engaged you for is a topic that actually came out through the unit of Old Testament studies that I did with you as my teacher, and it's retribution theology. And I would love it if because I would say that a lot of people listening to this may not have ever heard of that kind of concept before. But the thing that I guess I walked away with is that this is a really significant theology that's present in the Old Testament. So with that, could you tell us what is retribution theology?
So retribution theology is quite a large concept. It's a broad theological concept, if you like. It addresses divine justice. It addresses, where good deeds are rewarded and bad deeds are punished. In our modern context, it bleeds into theodicy and, the question of the divine role in suffering and evil and all that kind of thing. It's quite a huge concept, and I'm not an expert in this, but I'm going to make a broad generalization and say in many religious traditions,
Mm,
not just Christianity or Judaism. And as a theological concept, like I am not a theologian. So as a theological concept, I can't kind of speak too broadly on it, but within that theological concept is something called the Retribution Principle.
mm,
That's what I can talk on. It's the Retribution Principle that embedded in the Old Testament text that is almost, from what I understand, the kernel then of the greater theology. And so it's the Retribution Principle itself is, if you had to define it, it would be that the righteous will prosper
mhm.
and the wicked will suffer.
Yeah.
And the amount that you prosper or suffer is proportional then to how righteous you are or how wicked you are.
Right.
And I use those terms righteous and wicked quite specifically. It would be easy to just kind of say good and bad,
Mm,
but the terms righteous and wicked are quite specific to wisdom literature. in Old Testament texts. And the retribution principle is embedded within our wisdom literature, which is why I like to use righteous and wicked. And righteous is obviously just right with God, and wicked is the opposite of that. You know, someone who sins, who does the wrong thing, that kind of, essentially bad. And in wisdom literature, we see those two opposites all the time. And this retribution principle puts those kind of together in that as well. And there's that, you know, one thing will cause this and the other thing will cause that.
Yeah. So is there like a passage or a reference, I mean, that comes to mind when like that you would say would be typical of this retribution principles?
Not possibly, but we see it threaded all throughout. So obviously Job would probably be the central text within which we see the retribution principle played out. We see it throughout the wisdom literature, and we also see it in some Psalms. So Psalms are not necessarily wisdom literature as a whole, but there are wisdom Psalms.
Yes.
So Psalm 1, for example, and we see and the righteous in there as well. And so we see it thread all the way throughout all of those texts. And I think it shows us how the Israelite theology understood in everyday life. And I think that's where I love wisdom literature, because it comes down to the nitty-gritty in terms of how Israelite people lived and understood and wrestled with God.
Yeah. So is there any evidence then that God was like potentially not on the same page with the Israelites in this kind of principle?
I think what we see is, and we kind of almost need to zoom out a little bit in terms of this, is in that the Israelite kind of theology of this, and particularly when we see the development of monotheism, because it does develop, is that if you zoom back out and you step back and you look at the ancient Near East, you kind of see that this idea of how ancient people viewed the divine and where suffering kind of fit into that was actually quite a massive topic, and it's way beyond our time kind of today. The gods of the ancient Near East, and of course there's many different, of course, civilizations, you know, in that large, broad theme of ancient Near East, they viewed the divine or gods, I'll call them like little g gods as opposed to capital G God. They weren't known to have been just. The gods of the ancient Near East were capricious, they were unreliable, they were unpredictable. And so when things went wrong, when suffering, when evil kind of took place, there were lots of other kind of reasons that the divine could go, oh, that's just not our fault, or like it doesn't matter, and that kind of stuff. So when you come to the development of monotheism and you've got Yahweh, who is, you know, the one true God, and he has set apart these people, he has now not only has he set his people apart, but he's set himself apart.
Yes.
And so he has become their God, and through their covenant relationship and all of that kind of stuff, you know, I will be your God and you will be my people. God has now set up this expectation that it's all on him. And I don't say that in a negative way. And it is like, I'm everything. And so there's this human expectation then that if you're everything, then the good and the bad is you. And even like passages like Ecclesiastes 7:14, for example, I'm paraphrasing this. Actually says God made the good and the bad. So there's now this expectation that if bad has happened, if there's suffering, if there's evil, then God has had a part to play in that. Whereas previously, the divine little g gods could kind of just get off the hook, if you like. And so this is where this idea of retribution theology and the retribution principle now kind of blossoms, because there's this expectation that God is all knowing, all powerful, the great Yahweh,
Mm.
he not only has the power to dispense justice, which is an expectation that he does, but he now has the character to be just.
Yeah.
So all the other ancient Near Eastern gods, there was no expectation that they were just
Yeah,
in the
right.
way that Yahweh is expected
Mm.
to be just, because he is just. So it's not just that he is all powerful. It's not just what he does, it's who he is.
Mm.
And that is how God is. That is how Yahweh, in this ancient Near Eastern sense, is so different
Mm.
to, any other divine being that is understood at that time. It's not just what he does, it's who he is.
Mm.
And that therefore brings expectations on him. And I think this is where human nature then comes into play.
Mhm.
We want to have control.
Yeah.
We want to understand. We want to try and explain the unexplainable.
Yes.
When bad things happen, we're not so much worried about the prospering bit because we're very happy with prospering. So when the suffering happens, so when bad things happen to good people, we want to know why.
Yeah.
We know how to explain that, because we can't control what we can't explain. And if we can't explain it and control it, then we can't avoid it.
Mm.
And so, I'm talking in very broad brushstrokes here, and I'm kind of from ancient understanding, which is very different to the modern understanding.
Absolutely.
But if we kind of slide down the scale towards the more modern understanding, we
Mm.
rise of logic, and we have the rise of philosophy,
Mm.
and where things like, which is way outside my wheelhouse, like theodicy and theology and philosophical wrestling with, the problem of evil, which, is not my area. But when we have this rise of the impact of human logic, and we start to think about the retribution principle, we start to kind of warp it because we're thinking about it so much. You know me, I like to take complicated things and bring them down to really simple ways. And sometimes I can go too far, but it's just the best way I can explain it is that of like a double-sided coin, like a heads and tails kind of a coin. One side of the coin is the definition that we've already talked about. So righteous will prosper, wicked will suffer.
Mm-hmm.
Human nature then kind of extrapolates that in our logic, and we kind of start to think about that. And then we kind of go, well, then the opposite must be true.
Yes.
So if someone is prospering, they must be righteous.
Mm.
And conversely, if someone is suffering, they must be wicked, or they
Mm.
have done something wrong. They must have sinned in some way. And so we flip the principle around, and we kind of go, well, they must both be true, because, it's two sides of one coin. If the righteous are going to prosper and the wicked will suffer, then my logic, which is where we actually get into trouble here,
Mm.
then if you or I are prospering, then we must be sweet. Or if you or I are suffering, then we must be wicked, or we must have done something wicked. And it's that conundrum, I think, sliding back to, the ancient world, that Israel starts to wrestle with.
Mm.
And the wrestle is what we see in our scriptures, in the wisdom literature. So in Job, big wrestle. Ecclesiastes, wrestle.
Mm.
Proverbs, and again, some of those kind of wisdom psalms. And we start to see the mess, because we kind of look at it, we go, but hang on. Like, we look at our lived experience, like Job,
Yes.
like this actually this doesn't look like this works.
Yes.
Look, yeah. So it's a very long answer.
No, it's a very good answer. I realize that I didn't put this question in here, so feel free to take your time to answer it. But what impact do you think that the idea that the Israelite people did not have a concept of the afterlife
Oh,
has on that?
huge. Absolutely huge. Because This is where we kind of need to think as Christians. Our Old Testament text is a Jewish text.
Mm.
It's in our Christian Bibles. And so we read it through a New Testament, Jesus' death, resurrection lens.
Yes.
But we're reading an Old Testament text, and wisdom literature obviously is a Hebrew text.
Mm-hmm.
Not the only wisdom literature. There's
Yep.
Jewish wisdom literature. This is just a small kind of subset. But it's this concept of the afterlife that is quite a distinct difference between the Christian understanding and the Jewish understanding. And I'm in no means an expert on Jewish understanding, but in general, we have a much more defined and robust understanding of the afterlife. And while the Jews have some kind of understanding of that, and one of my students has just written a great research essay on this whole question of what was the understanding of the afterlife. In general, when it comes to the retribution principle, as Christians, we have less of a wrestle because we have this understanding that if I don't see justice done in this life, I have, as a Christian, great confidence that it will come in the next life.
Mm.
And I can kind of sit in the tension of that a little bit better. Yes. But from a Jewish point of view, as I understand it, the retribution principle was so important because for them, justice needed to come in this life.
Mm.
They didn't kind of have that, what's that kind of word, like that backstop of eternal judgment and that kind of stuff to kind of be the catch-all of anything that doesn't get resolved to our expectations and satisfaction in this life. It'll be okay in the afterlife.
I should probably jump in here for a second too, just in case we've skipped a step for the listeners.
Yeah.
The Old Testament doesn't speak so much to the idea of an afterlife. That's why we're talking about this, because for us, it's a critical part of our faith that we actually have a life after this, and in some ways we've already started that life. But for the Old Testament, there's not a really deep, solid theology to say that they had a concept of that there is something after this. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, I mean, they have Sheol, and there are texts that I can't tell you off the top of my head. I know Daniel, but there is a concept of the afterlife, but it have nowhere near the significance as it does for us as Christians in Christianity. And so
we can assume to a degree that for the people of that time, that the relevance of what happened in their life in that time as they are living was far more significant.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so justice and the end of suffering, they wanted evidence of that here and now, in lifetime kind of thing, way that we do too.
Yes.
But if it doesn't happen, we can kind of go, well, then I believe that God will make that right eventually.
So do you think too then that because if God doesn't rectify a situation, say in terms of justice or whatever in a person's lifetime, there's some bearing on who God is for that not having happened?
It can do for a particular person, absolutely. It comes down to, your expectations on God. And I think that comes down to your understanding, therefore, conscious or not, of the Retribution principle, and your understanding of what you expect God to do. And I think that's what we see in the Old Testament texts as well, particularly in some of the Psalms. So there's Psalms, I mean, we see the principle throughout a lot of the Old Testament texts, but in Psalms in particular, there's Psalm 37, I think, Psalm 49, really articulate this kind of annoyance, frustration with God. Like, what on earth are you doing? I can see the wicked just getting away with it. And what on earth, why? What on earth are you doing?
Mm.
And so I take great comfort that I can read that in the scriptures so that when I am feeling the same way, I don't feel so alone in that. It doesn't fix it,
Yes. Yeah.
but I don't feel so alone in my frustration, God, when he doesn't do what I'm expecting he should in all my great wisdom. And like, I'm laughing, I'm being flippant here. And I know
Yes.
we don't, these are all serious kind of things.
Yes.
But that response and reaction comes when God doesn't meet our expectations.
Which are sometimes expectations that we believe we've derived from scripture too, right? Because we think he's going to be righteous, he's going to be just, and he is, but it's not necessarily delivered on the timing that we believe it should be.
Absolutely. And I think that that's kind of the wrestle for us.
Mm.
And we certainly see that in Job. We see that absolutely in Job, and certainly in our human experience. We look around and we kind of go, I know there are righteous people who are suffering,
Yes.
righteous people who are not prospering. And I also, as I said before, I see people who are doing the wrong thing and they are just getting away with it.
Absolutely.
And so that leads to this wrestle where we start to question things, and we will either question, there's a few things we'll question depending on who we are, and just, or we question it all, or we just give up altogether, which is unfortunate. But we either question the nature of God. So we either start to think, well, God just mustn't be just then. He isn't who I thought he was. We rationalize things and we go, well, maybe God's justice is not what I think it's not the same as justice as I understand it. Maybe we don't actually know who God really is. Or right down the other end, there is no God. And Job's friends, they don't say there is no God, but Job's friends are starting to kind of ask these kind of questions.
Yeah.
Or we question the nature of suffering itself. And we go, maybe suffering isn't the punishment that we think it might be if we actually we've sinned and that's why we're suffering. Maybe, and again, we read this in Job, that what we think is punishment is actually like a lesson that we have to learn. It's like educational.
Yep.
Or we actually start to think that suffering is, that there's a spiritual benefit to our suffering and that it's a thing for us to suffer. We see that in the rise, if you've studied the early church, there was so much suffering during all the period of persecution. As soon as the persecution kind of, tapers off and they start to kind of, post Constantine, they start to actually not be killed for believing in Jesus, which is a great thing. There's a segment you kind of go, oh no, I'm not suffering enough. And then we see the rise of martyrdom. We see the rise of, self-suffering so that I can be like Christ. Again, that kind of, I'd say warps the idea of suffering. People may disagree with that. Or we start to question the timing of things and question the timing of the retribution principle. And this, as we just talked about, is that difference between the Jewish and the Christian understanding. Because from a Christian point of view, I can go, okay, the timing of this is maybe different. And that while I expect this, retribution to happen now, maybe the timing is that it won't happen now and that I want to be patient and one day, whereas the Jewish were like, now.
Yes. Yeah.
Has to come now. And if it doesn't come now to my satisfaction, then that is not okay. And so, we see that in different ways throughout the text.
So you've talked about Job a few times already. I just want to sort of zone in on that for a second. So when I have read Job since learning about the retribution principle, so you can tell me if this is wrong or not, but the thing that I find really interesting is that if you look at the Friends, they are so sold out on the retribution principle that it must mean everything else is wrong. So they therefore determine that, well, maybe you've done something, or maybe it was your, father's father, or whatever, logic they work through, right? Because they are so committed to the retribution principle, that it must mean everything else is incorrect or whatever. It almost gives this impression that God is actually trying to undo, to a degree, the level of commitment they have to this ideology, because Job is obviously far more righteous than anyone else because we get the backstory. And the real reason why he is suffering has absolutely nothing to do with him himself. In fact, he somewhat attracts suffering because he is so good, which is like, even more revolutionary. So, what sort of bearing does that? I mean, it almost makes you wonder: was God really in agreement with this idea, or was it the level of, because I think it's possible that we can even idolize a principle, and we can even put a concept, at the level of idolatry, right? So, is it possible that that's what was happening in Job? Because it seems to be such a revolutionary story in the midst of this retribution principle idea.
So, look, I'm not an expert on Job, but
Neither am I, but but we can talk about it.
yeah.
Yeah.
So what I see in Job, and I think when you read Job, and look, it's a long slog, the book of Job.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
When you read it, what some of the friends are saying actually sounds quite reasonable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's probably what I would say. If I was sitting with my friend going through what Job's going through, that's probably exactly what would come out of my mouth. And so it's quite disconcerting, I think, when we read the text. We know, as the literary device that you just referred to, we know more than the characters in this narrative. And so we understand that Job hasn't done anything wrong. And as you said, he has, I don't like to use the word targeted, but, a point is being proven here that he has done absolutely nothing wrong. But I think that one of the tensions in the book of Job is that we have all the friends and we have, them, saying what they do and misunderstanding things and etc. But we also have Job, who certainly gets jack of all of this towards the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Job demands of God an explanation. Like, what on earth are you doing here? And one of the tensions, certainly for me in the book of Job, is that God never actually answers him.
Yes, that's right.
You know him, he dialogues with him in a sense, but he never actually gives an adequate answer. And I think that's actually quite key. And I can talk about retribution principle in terms of the other wisdom literature kind of text second. But in Job in particular, what is hammered home to me is that God does not defend himself. He does not give an answer. He doesn't even, it's not even that he gives an answer that Job can't kind of cope with. It's almost like God, I don't answer to you. I don't need to tell you this because I'm God and you are not. And that's a tension for us. Because as we read the book of Job, it's almost like we all deserve an answer to this.
Yeah.
We don't get one. And I think that's really key.
It's funny because you see that again too in Jeremiah, where Jeremiah is asking, he says, well, it says something like, I question you on your justice or something like that. And then God comes back and says, how are you supposed to ride with the horses? Or, it's like, he's not really answering the question. He's saying, well, if you can't handle this, how are you going to handle, that?
Yes. And I think that, that brings something that's, outside the scope of what we're going to talk about today. But you've got the retribution principle. We're talking about this from a very individual point of view. But there's also the retribution principle for Israel itself.
Very true. Yeah.
And so when we talk about Jeremiah, the exile, the Babylonian exile, is this point of great spiritual crisis for the people of Israel. And so, where is God in all of that? Like, there's the retribution principle and how we kind of deal with it on an individual basis, but then there's all kind of not corporate, but like larger scale community way in which they have to deal with it as well, which is going on there.
Mm.
same way.
Mm.
But I think not only do we not see any kind of answer from God in Job,
Mm.
but as I would have taught you guys in class, we can't just read one piece of wisdom literature and get that full picture.
Yes, true.
Um, so do you remember my visual picture of that? I'm putting you on the spot now.
There were actually a lot of visual pictures, Edwina, so you might have to specify.
So I had a stool, a three-legged stool. Uh,
Mhm.
and that's kind of how we talk about wisdom literature, or how I talk about wisdom literature, in the sense that with Job, with Ecclesiastes, and with
Ah,
Proverbs,
yes. I do remember this.
yeah, that they're each a leg of the stool. And with
Mm.
each three-legged stool, if you take one or two legs away, you're going to fall flat.
Mm.
And so we have to look at wisdom literature, together into that. So we can't just pull Job out, or we can't
True.
Proverbs out. And
Mm.
Proverbs in particular, I think this is where we get into trouble, because Retribution Principle, as I kind of said it as that nice kind of definition,
Mhm.
is proverbial. It's like it's a proverb.
Mm.
But Proverbs, particularly chapter kind of 10, 11, and 12, fully support the retribution principle.
Mm.
But this is where understanding the genre that we're reading in our scriptures is that Proverbs, as a literary style or a piece of literature, proverbial. That's exactly what
Mm.
they are. Generalization.
Yes.
They are not universal truths in every situation.
Yes.
And so Proverbs gives us, whereas we've got this real gritty Job kind of, no answers, suffering thing, then we've got this other leg of Proverbs that's like, it's all nice and neat. And
It's the ideal, isn't it?
yes, absolutely. Ideal generalization.
Mm.
You've then got Ecclesiastes, which is a whole other.
Yeah.
And in there, you kind of see, I think it's in like Ecclesiastes chapter at the beginning of chapter 5. It's like, you better do your rituals, otherwise God will be angry with you. Which, like, we've got to do the right thing so that we prosper. If we do the wrong thing, we're going to suffer. But we can't look at the retribution principle and kind of think that it's a guarantee, because Job shows us that it's not.
Mm.
Actually, don't need Job. We just live our life. The lived experience with us, that it's not a promise. It's not a guarantee.
Yeah.
Generalization that tells us about who God is.
Yeah.
But when we take it as this black and white guarantee, that's when we get into trouble, and we twist ourselves in knots to either defend it
Mm-hmm.
or explain it.
Mm.
Or it's just not possible as we see.
So let's fast forward then, right? So let's look at present day Christianity. Do you see evidence that we as Christians often believe this? I'm not saying that it's wrong to believe it either.
Yeah.
But should not the new covenant have some bearing on how we now? I suppose in some ways, I sometimes, especially after having done the unit and understanding this retribution theology / principle, it made me realize that there is a way that we often interpret the Old Testament as though it is law. There are certain things in Proverbs even where I've heard people go, well, that's the way it is because that's that, yeah, exactly. And so, and obviously not having the knowledge about retribution principles may even encourage you to think that way, right? But there's a bearing that the new covenant, I presume, should have on this, because you look at the apostles themselves, and I think, it's like a 98% hit rate that all of them were martyred for their faith. So surely prosperity is not the end of righteous behavior. So do you see this in present day is, I guess, my question, and is it harmful?
Yes. Okay. So I definitely see it in present day in two ways. Before I say that, though, in case I forget, just remind me.
Sure.
Jesus actually addresses this.
Okay.
There's 2 times in the Gospels that Jesus comes up against the retribution principle in straight out questions from his disciples. And so in both cases, Jesus does exactly the same thing. So first, I won't say first because not in order, but we see it in John. So in John chapter 9, the disciples, there's a blind man, and the disciples actually say to Jesus, who sinned? Not did anyone sin, but who sinned? Was it this man? Did he sin and that's why he's blind? Or did his parents sin and that's why he's blind? And what Jesus does is he just rejects the premise of the question. You know, if you're a West Wing fan, you know that the first thing is you just reject the premise of the question of like, that's just not even the question that you should ask. We then see it in Luke 13, where again, something, I don't remember exactly what's happened, but some Galileans, there's a tragedy and some Galileans have died. And the disciples say to Jesus again, did they die? Did this tragedy happen or did they die because they were sinners? And again, Jesus rejects the premise of the question. And both times where the disciples are coming to Jesus wanting to know the cause of the suffering, Jesus shifts this focus away and instead focuses on the possible wider purpose suffering and what God might do through that. And so we see that, you know, as Christians in the new kind of covenant, we can still, as the disciples did, slip back into this kind of what has caused this, whether it is my prosperity or my suffering. And again, Jesus just, like, it's actually not about that. So to answer your questions, the two main ways I see this in today's society is related to what the disciples said in the Gospels. I don't necessarily think I see this as much these days, but that's probably in my Protestant Australian culture, and it could be in other pockets. Christianity, possibly, I hesitate to say this in case I'm wrong, possibly more either Catholic or Orthodox traditions, is focus again on like what did you do wrong, in terms of the assumption that some kind of tragedy or suffering is due to sin. The last time I saw this was the AIDS epidemic. You know, I think that was in the 80s. You know, I'm old enough to kind of remember that unfolding in real time, kind of like the way we've just lived through the pandemic. We're going to be, you have kind of like, I was even talking yesterday to someone of like, we just didn't know, like at that point, what we then learned like 6 months later, and then 6 months later, like we lived that in real time. And we look back at the AIDS epidemic, or same with the COVID pandemic, just how much we didn't know until we knew it. And the response and reaction, particularly from, you know, I'm going to say the evangelical Christian church to the AIDS epidemic, that they don't deserve, anyone with AIDS doesn't deserve our help because they must have sinned. Or they have sinned, and you know, God has brought this upon them. That is the retribution principle.
That is actually a very harmful one, which I didn't even think about until now, which is the fact that it almost means or gives us a way out to say that we shouldn't help. Even though God spoke so much about helping the oppressed and helping the poor and justice and all of these other principles, it almost clashes with it, isn't it? Like,
completely. There was a hint of it in some kind of areas after the tsunami in Asia. I think that was Boxing Day or something. I'm bad with years and how long ago it happened. That, you know, it didn't get any traction like it did with the AIDS epidemic. But, you know, again, this kind of, oh, that terrible tragedy has happened because they've sinned or they're sinners or they've done something wrong. I see that as much in everyday life as it would have done at some point. I do see, though, more in our day and culture is, you know, whether it's called the prosperity doctrine or
prosperity gospel.
Well, and, people will disagree with me, I'm sure, on this, but I see that as a warping
Yes.
of side two. If you remember that coin that I talked about,
Mm.
because I'll get back to the coin in terms
Mm.
of something in a minute, but the prosperity gospel to me warps that side two
Yes.
of the retribution principle
I
coin.
would definitely agree with you on that, because I would say that some of my Christian experience has been in the prosperity gospel kind of thinking. And I almost would say that I've had to detox it, because there's things in you, like there's something that happened even just like last year or something. And I remembered going, oh, why is this happening to me? And I was like, well, the fact that you asked that question, Mel, almost tells that you still have this remnant of that you somehow deserved better because you thought you were living righteously. Whereas the truth is that, well, any suffering I may go through, which, suffering is a big word in itself, right? It doesn't necessarily allude to whether like my actions determine that or not. Do you know what I mean? Like some of it's sometimes stuff that God is just like teaching you things through. And now I'm very grateful for those, episodes of suffering, because, they were opportunities to learn something that I didn't know. But yeah, I would say that, I've often had friends too that have come who have been in ideologies that I would say are probably quite prosperity gospel driven. And they'll often come to me and be like, well, I don't understand because I did this and I did that and I did this and I lived this way. Or the other flip side is, well, I deserved this because I did this and I did this and I did this. And you're sort of like,
And that's not
yeah,
helpful.
no.
When we domesticate God,
Mm,
or I call it like vending machine theology. Like we put in our coins of like, I did this and this and this. And therefore, because I have, done A, B, and C, God, I now demand out of
yes.
my, vending machine theology that you must do 1, 2, and 3 because I did A, B, and C.
Mm,
And I think that's the proverbial nature of the prosperity doctrine as well, that they
mm,
take proverbial generality
mm,
and like claim the promise. And it's a promise that was never, in my interpretation, never a generality. And I see people who cling on to that framework then completely fall apart when it doesn't
mm,
meet their expectations.
yes.
And as much as, and again, saw this in Job, as much as God is just and loving and kind, he is also God
Mm,
and does not owe us an explanation.
mm,
He does not owe us, what we expect or want. And I think we have no concept of what he's either providing us or saving us from.
absolutely.
There's a great analogy in terms of this idea of suffering. Of you're in a car, God's driving the car, you're in the back seat of the car, but you're blindfolded and you can't see what's going on and you can't see where you're going. But you trust the God's driving and you're driving down the freeway. It's cruisy, you're just kicking back, having a nap, everything's awesome. But then suddenly things aren't smooth and you're obviously not on a freeway anymore. And it's like God's just driven the car off the freeway and you're careening over things and you're being tossed around in the back of the car and you still can't see what's going on. You don't know where you are and you don't know where the heck God is going and what on earth got into him and any of this. And we can't explain any of it because we can't see it. We don't know what we're doing. And, but what we don't understand is that God may have just careered off the freeway to save us from hitting something that was there.
Yes.
He's taken us down this gorge, which has been a horrific experience for us in the back of the car, but he went down the gorge so we didn't go off a cliff.
Mm,
And it's this kind of, we don't know what we don't see.
yes.
We can't, when we're blindfolded, we can't even imagine what we're not seeing. And we actually things that aren't even there. But there's this absolute trust that we need to have that God is still driving the car.
Mm,
And whatever suffering we're going through in the back seat right now as we kind of go off road, is actually better than what it would have been if we didn't.
Yes.
And that's certainly what I hang on to as a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And that's faith to me.
Yeah. Yep.
That, through my marriage breakdown and divorce and through health things and, other, suffering, if you like, in quotation marks, in my, I don't know what it would have been if those things hadn't happened. And places I'm glad, as you just kind of said there, in my perspective now, I'm actually glad. I didn't enjoy the suffering, but I know who I am because of the suffering
Yes.
I've been through.
Absolutely.
I think that's the key thing, that God is just, and that even if justice doesn't come in the form that I want, I know that God is just and is faithful. And no matter the circumstances, because we've got, free will, other people impacting my life, all that stuff, that God will bring justice out of every circumstance. He will bring, Joseph, the story, that God will bring good out of any evil happens, because we live in a world that is fallen. We live in a world where people do horrible things, Living in Sydney, we're seeing that every time I turn on the news, like evil things. But God, I believe God redeems those things eventually. And I think God brings good and justice out of everything in some way this time.
Yeah. Well, we should probably bring it to a close. There's so much more we could actually talk on. I'm hoping that from our conversation that at least some of the listeners are encouraged to go and maybe even study a little bit more about this, because I think the Old Testament is such a beautiful and rich, set of books and literature that we can read. And so there's the fun of enjoying it at another level, when you study it a bit more. But there's also like the fact that there is some care that's required when we read the Bible at all, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, right?
Yeah.
I suppose the last question I want to ask you is what awareness should we have, or how should the awareness of this particular concept inform how we now approach the Old Testament? What would your encouragement be?
Like I think if you get back to the coin, the side one of the coin, that the righteous will prosper and the wicked will suffer, that is scriptural. That is what we see throughout Scripture, but in a proverbial generalized sense. The other side that we then warp and do all horrible kind of things to. And so when we read our Old Testament, it's understanding, and I say this all the time in class, and this is a quote from John Walton, who is an Old Testament scholar. Old Testament was written for us, and Holy Spirit, reveals things through the text to us, but it was not written to us. The Old Testament text, all of them as individual texts within our Old Testament canon, at a particular time, in a particular context, for a particular audience, for a particular reason. And so we can't pull out these principles. Well, they are principles that we can then apply to our life, but we can't kind of take them as we can't turn a proverb generalized principle into something that is, applicable to me today,
Like as a law.
Yeah, without actually thinking about what this meant in its original context to its original reader or recipient or audience, and then what the principle of that is and what that means then to me today. And until we do that work on what it meant then we can't actually apply it well, not say right or wrong, but well to in our context today, particularly with the Old Testament, because it's a Jewish text and we're Christians. So we have this whole other lens of Christ, the resurrection, all of that stuff. And so I think the Retribution Principle is a great example of just being aware of, as you kind of mentioned before, when we start kind of going, well, God should, when we can't start like making presumptions about, presuming to know what God should do, presuming that we understand what God thinks, presuming to judge someone else's spirituality, demanding of God that he should behave in a particular way or give us, as you said, like, I don't deserve this or I do deserve this. That there's some obligation. God has some obligation to behave in a way that suits me right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's when we kind of need to step back and go, actually, God is God.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not. He loves me. He wants the best for me. Jesus died for me. And that's where I start. And that's the posture in which I then read the script.
Yes, that's very good. Excellent. What a great note to end on. Oh, wow. That was awesome, Ed. And yeah, so appreciate your time. And thank you so much for contributing your thoughts and your expertise. And it was awesome. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Pink Elephant. You can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, or you can check out my resources on my website, meljsayward.com.